Section 1.2, the distributive property. The distributive property is to multiply the sum or difference inside the parentheses by the number outside the parentheses. Here's a arithmetic look. What I want to do is take a number that's outside the parentheses and multiply it across each number inside the parentheses, which is going to be either added or subtracted from each other. In other words, 5 times 2, and then the plus sign would come over, and then 5 times 8. Similarly here, even if the number is on the right side of the set of parentheses, again, 5 times 2, bring over the plus sign, 5 times 8. And with subtraction, same thing. 5 times 2, bring over the minus sign, 5 times 8. And again, if it's on the right side, 5 times 2, minus sign, 5 times 8. The algebraic expression for this is A, B, and C, where A, B, and C could be any real number, but the effects are still the same. A times B, plus sign, A times C, and with every other example down below. Our first example, use the distributive property to simplify. In other words, what I want to do is break this number into two numbers and then multiply each number by 7. A lot of times it's difficult to multiply 7 times a larger number. But if I break this into two numbers that are easy for me, then it's easier for me to find the product of these two values. There's two ways to do this. First, let's bring down a 7, and let's find two numbers that add together to give me 13. Usually what I do is I subtract down to where I get a tens digit, and that would give me 10. 13 minus 3 gives me 10. And how do I get 10 to become 13? Add 3. Now what I do is in my head I use a distributive property. 7 times 10 is 70, plus 7 times 3 is 21. Now I find their sum. The solution is 91. The other way to do this is to go higher than 13. In other words, what tens digit is above 13? And that would be 20. And that would be 7, and then 20. And what number from 20 gives me 13? And that would be minus 7. 20 minus 7 is 13. Now I use a distributive property. 140 minus 49. And my solution here will be 91. You actually could have used 15, 15 minus 2. But the difficulty might be taking 7 times 15. So a lot of times it's better to take a number that has a 0 in it or a tens digit. And that way it's easier to use your product. Number 2, 8 times 148. Let's start with two numbers that add to 148. So I have 8, and then I'm going to choose 140 plus 8. Again, these are still large numbers, but a lot easier than 148. So 8 times 148, 8 times 0 is going to give me 0. That's 32. Carry the 3, that's going to be 1120. 8 times 8 is 64. And when I find their sum, I'm going to get 1,184. Now let's do the subtraction method. I bring down the 8, and I'm going to go 150 minus 2. And notice the sum is 148, the difference is 148. So now I multiply 8 times 150, 8 times 0, 0, 8 times 5, 40, put down a 0, carry the 4, 1,200. Minus 16, which is 8 times 2. And I have 1,200 minus 16 is 1,084. Again, in each case, my solutions had better be the same. Here I want to simplify each expression. 1, 5 times 6 plus 5 times 3. In other words, they've already distributed. They have 5 times the sum of 6 and 3. So 5 times 6 is 30. Bring down the plus sign. 5 times 3 is 15. And again, I want to copy this down and work down the page. And now I simplify, find the sum. I'm going to get 45. Number 2, 8 times 4, 32. Bring down the minus sign. 10 times 4, 40. And now remember, I go back to the rules for adding and subtracting integers. Here I have a positive 32, a negative 40, or I can rewrite this as 32 plus a negative 40. I would rather just have you think of this as a negative 40. In either case, I have different signs, therefore I want to subtract. 40 minus 32 is 8. Use the sign of the larger, which is negative. Here I want to multiply. Number 1, I want to distribute. Again, copy the problem, and then 8 times k. Remember, this is really a coefficient of 1. So 8 times 1 is 8k. Bring down the minus sign. 8 times 5 is 40. And at this point, we'll just leave it in this fashion. Number 2, 8 times 2g. 8 times 2 is 16. G, bring down the plus sign. 8 times 7 is 56. Again, copy the problem, distribute, and now we're simplified. Number 3, a negative 4 times 12 minus 5m. Here I'm going to distribute, and I have to know the rules for multiplying integers, which means positive and negatives. Negative times a positive, that's a negative. 4 times 12 is 48. Here, this is a minus sign, but in actuality, that tells me that this is a negative 5. So a negative times a negative is a positive, and that's 4 times 5 is 20m. And as you go through, kind of say this in your mind. Negative times a positive is a negative. Negative times a negative is a positive. And of course, multiplying is simple for us. Again, we want to multiply. And notice now, we usually have a number out to the left of our parentheses, but here it's to the right. It doesn't matter. I can just distribute. 9 times 11 is 99. And positive times a positive is positive. Positive times a negative is a negative. 8 times 9 is 72u. Or what you also could do is you could rewrite this by using a property that we used in our last section, which is the commutative property. 9 times 11 minus 8u. Again, it's the same thing. 9 times 11, I get 99. 9 times a negative 8, negative 72u. Either way, it would be up to you. But again, copy the problem and show that step, or use commutative property and then show that step. Number 5, here I have my number to the right again, but I'm still using the distributive property. Negative times a negative is a positive 14. But I don't need to show the positive symbol. Here I have a negative times a negative, which is a positive 14d. Now there I have to show it because I don't want this to look like I'm multiplying, so I have to show that symbol, and that represents a positive 14d. Now I want to go back to the beginning of this section, and I just want you to take a look at once I perform my distributive property, copy the problem, and then I perform the distributive property, notice what's happening to my parentheses. They go away because I performed that property. 8 times 1k, 8k, 8 times a negative 5, negative 40. And the parentheses are now gone. And you can see that in every single problem, that once I perform the distributive property, the parentheses go away. And you have to make sure you do that every time you use a distributive property. Once I perform the operation, the parentheses go away. And again, here, you could have gone a negative 14 and a negative 1 minus d. And again, that's just using the commutative property, changing order. Our next example, we want to use the distributive property to simplify. In this case, what I want to do is take 4 times 12, and that's 48. And negative 4 times 18 is a negative 72. Now what I'm going to do is subtract, and that's going to give me a negative 24. Now remember, we're going to subtract because this is a positive 48, this is a negative 72. And therefore, they're different signs. I'm going to subtract, and that gives me 24, but 72 is larger than 48, and it is negative. Or we also could write that as, if you need to do this step, 48 plus a negative 72. In each instance, my solution is going to come back to here. Positive, negative, different sign, subtract, use the sign of the larger. This example, number 2, it looks a little bit more confusing because of the dot to represent multiplication rather than the parenthesis. Well, what you could do is just put parentheses around that second integer. And now that would look very similar to this. And now all I'm going to do is multiply 16 times a negative 4, which is going to give me a negative 64. And this is going to give me a negative 24 times a negative 4, which is going to give me a positive 96. Negative times a negative is a positive. 4 times 24 is 96. You could bring down the minus sign, and then 24 times a negative would give me a negative 96. Then the double negative would make it positive. I'm trying to shorten that step up for you by going negative times a negative. Now, I know that this is a negative 64, positive 96, different signs. I want to subtract. I'm going to get 32. And when I subtract, I use the sign of the larger. 96 is bigger than 64. It's positive. Solution is positive. In our last example, Kim has basketball practice 4 days per week. Each practice lasts 2 hours. How many hours a week does she practice? 4 days per week, each one at 2 hours. 4 times 2 means she practices 8 hours per week.